Welcome to the 7th episode of the Euromines mining podcast. This episode is a special one because for the first time we do it hybrid. And with us is Jessica Fung from Project Blue. You're the head of consultant at Project Blue. And please tell us a bit what you're doing there. What is Project Blue? What is your role? And what is the outcome and the output that you are providing to your customers?
Perfect. Thank you, Florian. So happy to be able to join you remotely today for this podcast. So Project Blue is a market intelligence firm. We cover over 30 critical mineral markets around the world. We have a team of about 50 analysts sitting around the world covering these markets. We provide information and market intelligence as well as forecasts on these markets to our client base. They include industry, investors, and government bodies. The consulting division at Project Blue, we provide bespoke strategic consulting and projects for our clients when they've got specific questions they need answered, or any other issues or niche areas that they want to take a look at. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And we're very curious to hear some of your insights that you can provide. But let me start off with a rather provocative question. So we have seen the focus on individual materials change over time. What would you suggest is now the sexy new material on the block?
I think that's a good question. So it's not really a new material. I think rare earths are still pretty sexy because they're so mysterious. I mean, what are these 17 elements, that hang out together in a group that everybody is talking about? I think it makes them quite sexy. And they're used in so many things, that make our everyday lives convenient. Electricity generation, cooling our electronics and our homes, many parts of our mobile phones, and all modes of transportation. So they are still a very cool group of minerals.
So they have always been somehow around as the cool group, right? Do you think they're really the coolest now? What happened to lithium? What happened to cobalt?
Oh, yeah, those ones are still around, of course. And, they were cool because they were the big obvious ones, right? When we were talking a lot about the energy transition, copper as well, copper, lithium, cobalt for a while. And these were really mainly driven by lithium-ion batteries and the significant growth we've seen in that industry over the last 10 years. What's interesting is if we look at, for example, the difference between a critical materials list and a strategic materials list, the US has this, as does the EU. The first list, which is critical, is kind of based on market fundamentals, right? So economic security, supply vulnerabilities. The strategic list is based on materials needed for defense technologies and military readiness. So there's a whole new category that has come up. And so these are the new cool materials. So you go from like battery materials and vanadium, and now more niche markets like antimony and titanium, tantalum, tungsten. But I like to think of it as just adding more cool kids to the mix rather than switching the focus entirely.
Where would you say is there an overlap between the strategic and the critical raw materials? I mean, in the EU, the strategic raw materials list is a subset of the critical raw materials list. Is it the same also in other jurisdictions?
There is a slight difference, particularly in the US. The strategic materials are not necessarily the same, although there is overlap. So, for example, rare earths definitely overlaps both of them. But there are a number of critical materials that cover all of the fastest growing industries in the world, right? Advanced technology, energy transition, and energy storage, as well as defense. So there are some that overlap, but then there are others that are a little bit more differentiated.
And when you talk about these lists, right? So they're also set up to generate the interest too of the market to invest into those. Do we see that there is a greater investor interest into strategic raw materials than before? Is there greater investor interest now into going into rare earth than we have seen 10 years ago or 5 years ago?
There is, I think, a greater awareness But whether there's a greater appetite is a different question, especially from investors. I think the opposite is, well, not the opposite, but from a government perspective, there is a greater awareness and also a greater appetite. And so we're starting to see, some of the governments really come in and make some creative moves to secure supply chains in these new cool critical materials. Investors struggle a little bit for a couple of reasons. If we think about, what are investors really interested in now?
Mm.
For a lot of them, it's still copper,
Oh,
because the connection to the growth and electrification, very,
yeah.
very clear. Building new mines, very expensive, and so there's a supply, challenge there. There's a sustainability angle to the market that's well known, right? It can be
Yeah.
recycled. We can have low carbon copper. But most importantly, it's a very large and liquid market. Prices are
Yeah.
visible to investors. They're hedgeable by investors. And so it's markets like that that are still more interesting from the investor side. But it's nice to see the governments coming in and stepping in to take an interest in these more niche, less known critical materials because they are really strategic and critical
Hmm.
for supply chains around the world.
You're alluding to Mountain Pass and the US administration.
That is certainly, I think, the most well-known recent deal that has happened. And that is a particularly interesting one because of how the government has come in and structured it, right?
Hmm.
For the first time, it feels like the government has come in and said, we will be a lead investor on this transaction. And that has not really happened before. What we have seen in the past is a lot of LOIs. Yeah, if you get the debt in, we will come and support and provide a guarantee, for this
Mm.
part or that part. But this is the first time where they've come in, they said, we are a lead investor. We are going to finance this plant, which we know we need to build in the US, right? So there's a real
Hmm.
recognition of the part of the supply chain that needs to get built out. And then they said, we're going to give you a price floor, right? This
Yeah.
has been discussed for quite some time, and they have actually come in and put a price in that price floor. And they said, but for us to give you this price floor, what we're going to take from you is a cash sweep of EBITDA above a certain amount at the plant, right? So they are going to generate returns that are
Hmm.
higher. And they said, we also want offtake of the material. So they have taken quite a bit out of this, but also put quite a bit in. And
Hmm.
in many ways, they've bookended,
Yeah.
MP materials as a supply chain. Now, what that means for investors is a little bit of a different story because when you have a government, that's come in and takes so much of this investment, what is really left? So that's the
Mm.
question for investors at this point. But MP Materials is a very high profile recent example of creative financing by a government body, for sure.
And I mean, this was mainly driven by strategic considerations, right? So, and in the EU, we now have this new mantra of competitiveness. Competitiveness is somehow everywhere, but the raw material space, in order to ensure competitiveness, is always a bit, the odd one out of the picture. Do you think the US example is something that we can emulate, or we should emulate?
I definitely think so.
Mm.
I think for the first time, there is a real world example of creative financing by a government body in critical materials that could potentially really get a supply chain built. These critical mineral lists and strategic mineral lists, they're only as good as, putting a piece of paper on the wall.
Mm.
But then you take a look at it and you have to say, what action comes out of this? What do we
Yeah.
do with this list? And unless government comes in as well and provides support, like real support, not just here's an approved project, it's also on another strategic project list, right? To me,
Yeah.
that almost feels like a high five from the government. But you kind of need a little bit more than that, right? You need subsidies or offtakes or loan
Yeah.
guarantees, like really something, euros on the table to really move these things forward. And yes, I think it's an example that can be
Mm.
emulated. And I think it's also an example of where a lot of risk that comes with these projects has been structured away because the US
Mm-hmm.
government has said, we are going to take these rare earths. We know that we need them, and we're going to put them into industry, right? So if the EU has the same sense of urgency of securing these raw
Mm-hmm.
materials for domestic purposes, there is a way to structure these transactions to be able to say, we will give you money, and in return, this is what we want from you because strategically it is very, very important to us.
So government intervention for the purpose of defense would drive competitiveness. Is that what you're saying?
Yes,
Yes?
exactly. And the key is to ensure that you are really signaling urgency
Mm.
to the market. I think when you put dollars or euros on the table, that is a real signal of urgency. And then when you do it in a creative way and structure it in a way that makes a lot of sense, both for the government, because this is taxpayer money, right?
Yeah.
And so they do have to be responsible for it, but there is a way to structure a little bit of the risk out of it. So I think that's quite possible.
So, but I mean, mountain pass, it's rare earth, it's heavy and light rare earth. Those are small quantities, small volumes. So a little bit of money can go already a long way. How about the bulkier commodities? You provided or Project Blue published a very interesting article on raw materials for defense. What do you see? Where do you see movements on the bulkier commodities, especially when it comes to mining and mining finance?
I guess on the bulkier materials, it does require a lot of capex. Luckily, most of the critical materials are relatively small markets,
Mm-hmm.
but there are bulkier markets that are required in these materials for super alloys in particular. Is one area that we are looking at. Super alloys are materials that are used in very, very extreme environments, exactly for aerospace and defense, but also energy and power
Mm-hmm.
generation. It's also used there. It can endure extreme heat and stress. Um, and so these super alloys do require steel, of course, so
Mm-hmm.
that's iron, and that's quite a bulky
Oh,
market, as well as nickel,
yeah.
cobalt, molybdenum, chrome. There's a few others in the
Mm-hmm.
niobium as well, and titanium. So there's a few materials in there that can be a little bit on the bulkier side.
Mm-hmm.
But what is interesting if we think about mining is there is a mix of mines that are involved in these materials. So some of them, yes, they can be very, very large mines. I think not so much the case in Europe,
Yeah.
but certainly elsewhere. If Europe wants to secure these raw materials from elsewhere, they can be larger projects. But this is where, partnerships between, I think, governments can come in very, very handy as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we just saw, for example, overnight, the US and Australia announced a strategic or a framework agreement
Mm-hmm.
to develop critical material supply chains. The EU, I believe, already has one with Australia, but there are probably other ones that can materialize in order to secure these supply chains. And when you
Mm-hmm.
can bring more people to the table, I think that helps a lot.
Right. So, I mean, nickel, you mentioned nickel, right? So that would somehow fall between the special minerals and the bulkier ones. Maybe we can zoom a bit in there here. So most of the nickel supply is coming from Indonesia at the moment. We have seen that Chinese investments are taking over nickel supply from Brazil. Russia is still exporting nickel. Um, what can be, for example, a useful solution to integrate nickel into the whole strategic supply chains and government intervention and defense purposes? Yeah, for this specific case.
Yeah, nickel is, as you said, it's a fascinating one. It's a small market and a large market at the same time. And it's used across so many critical sectors, right? So stainless steel is, of course, still the main driver. Europe is still, I think, produces about 10% of the world's stainless steel. So
Mm-hmm.
it is still a good part of that industry, and nickel is certainly used in Europe for that. Um, Again, super alloys for high performance engines. Also very important critical material in an emerging and very, very fast growing industry. Um, but of course, the fastest growing application is lithium ion batteries. So nickel gets to hit all points in terms of, where demand is. Um, And I remember speaking at the LME Metals Forum a number of years ago, and I think at the time I said, by the end of this decade, a quarter of the nickel market would be used as an energy source to power our lives. Right? The idea
And
that a metal can be an energy
yeah,
source, I think was quite interesting at the time. Anyway, the message really was, for some of these metal markets that we take for
yeah,
granted, they evolve very, very quickly. And so when we think about the supply side, to answer your question, I can't think of another market where there has been so much innovation so
okay.
quickly in the last 20 years. It used to just be metal and
Mm,
ferronickel. And certainly there are European companies that are involved in the production of that.
mm,
Then we went to nickel pig iron, which was very much in China and Indonesia. And then there was another surge in MHP capacity about 5 years ago, and that's largely in Indonesia. But there are, plants in Madagascar
mm.
and in the Philippines as well.
Yeah, where I wanted to get is, would nickel be, for example, a case that would lend itself to similar intervention as we've seen with rare earth? Or is it too
I
too
think
too bulky, maybe?
uh, I think that there is nothing that is too bulky for intervention. If it is critical
Yeah.
enough, and if there is a good enough understanding of which parts of the supply chain are really required to be built
Hmm.
out, I think there is absolutely room for intervention. Um, and this evolution of the nickel supply chain that has happened so quickly allows for that opportunity because now there are plants that can switch very quickly between different products. Do you need metal? Do you need
Mm.
chemical for batteries, right? Like the ability to switch between these products, there's no reason why Europe cannot build this capacity,
All right.
right? So
Yeah.
there is a possibility, and when you can build this kind of flexibility into the system, then you can meet the different needs as they
Mm.
arise,
But
and depending on market conditions.
mm.
So
but
absolutely, I think this is a great example.
but to start with, you would need a mine, right?
Huh.
No.
Yes,
So
indeed, 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 and yes, there are not that many nickel operations in Europe. I think there are only
yeah.
three, and they're relatively small scale. But there's no reason why Europe could not secure feedstock from another country by partnering and investing there and supporting with infrastructure. That is certainly
Mm.
something that we are seeing again the U.S. do in Australia with the recently announced gallium circuit at Alcoa's operation.
Mm.
Or there are also, I believe, some tantalum
Yeah.
operations that, are also feeding that supply chain. So it can be done to find the feedstock.
We see that nickel is also playing a role in the G7 discussion on standards-based markets, right? So, and one of the reasons is also that very often deposits are rather small, rather expensive to mine, and you can secure your feedstock cheaper from elsewhere. And with this Damocles sword, with this risk always dangling over your head, how can we strengthen our supply chains, starting with the mine, starting with this huge upfront investment to mine nickel?
That is a very, very good question. I guess there are two ways to go about securing feedstock. You either need to build a new mine or you can acquire an existing one. And where we have not seen a lot of creativity, to be honest, is in the, I guess, willingness to acquire existing operations because they exist. For nickel, for example, I think the general consensus view is that this is a very oversupplied market for probably a few years to come, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, there will be potentially more price pressure. And so to try to put a price floor under it would be very difficult to support new small projects that could potentially be high cost. So why not acquire existing operations? And then you don't have a construction risk. You get access to feedstock right away. And if it's priced and structured appropriately, then it could be quite a permanent source of feedstock, I think, into the European market.
All right. No, very interesting. And if you would need now, I mean, 10 years ago you talked about nickel as an energy material. If you would need to give the similar speech today, what would be your prediction for 10 years? Which would be your key mineral, your key material to look out for?
Oh, in 10 years, there are quite a few that we could look out for, I think. Um, Probably, oh, that's a good question, Florian. I need to think about this one. I don't think I have one.
Okay, you can also have like a suit of different materials. It's a, shall we say, magnesite?
Oh, magnesite. I could, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there's a few materials that we could possibly prioritize in terms of thinking about over the next 10 years. Not necessarily a very clean list. Um, but okay, so the easy screen. First, you focus on the materials that are consumed across all of the really fast-growing sectors, right? Defense and batteries and advanced technology and semiconductors. So you've got rare earths and tin, which is used in soldering, aluminum, nickel, copper, of course, cobalt, antimony is another one. So these ones are all used. And then the more interesting materials, actually, to me, the ones that need a little bit deeper digging are the ones that are used to manufacture this equipment. So not that's necessarily used and
Ah,
included in the equipment, but used to
but the
manufacture
input.
batteries.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Semiconductors, defense
Yeah.
equipment. And this is where you get some really interesting materials. Tungsten is one
Mm.
because it's used in the tooling, and that's advancing very, very quickly. Titanium, magnesia, molybdenum is another one. Fluorine is a particularly interesting mineral in
All
my view
right.
to look at. So these are very, very interesting niche minerals that without them, we could not manufacture
Ah,
all the
yeah.
equipment
Yeah.
that we need.
Not possible,
So
right?
that's another way to look at it. Yeah. So I think those are some interesting ones to look at over the next 10 years.
So you would like to look at the unsung heroes, let's put it like that. Those that are not in the
Yes.
limelight at the moment. Okay. But do
Yes. But
you,
they will be cool
they will be
in
cool.
10 years.
Everyone has their moment to shine, right?
That's
But
right. That's right.
do you think there might be a crunch of any of these materials? Do we see already supply concentrations forming? Is there movement there? Or are we already quite well diversified that we do not need to be too concerned?
Oh, unfortunately, all of these materials make their way onto a critical
Mm,
minerals list exactly because of import dependence and
mm,
supply concentration and importance to the economy. So Europe has
yeah.
65 minerals on the critical minerals list, right? And you know what the criteria are.
Yeah, I know it very
And
well. Yeah.
yeah. Uh, and so yes, so these supply chain challenges
Mm.
already exist, which is why it is so urgent to try and sort out a supply chain, alternate supply chains to the ones that already exist and are very, very tied up.
So when we look back now to the critical and the strategic minerals, right? So I mean, they are strategic because they're used in many, many different sectors that we deem absolutely necessary. I mean, energy production is one, pharmaceutical is one, health is one, defense
Mm.
is a very, very important one, right? So, um, I mean, they're competing at one point with each other, no? With the supply security. Where do you see the first the first points of competition or even cannibalization happening?
We do see substitution happening in a few areas,
Mm?
exactly because sometimes the supply chain bottlenecks or the price are too strong and the prices are too high. Um, and so we've already seen it in some applications, such as flame retardants.
Hmm.
There's some substitution that's taking place there. Certainly in batteries, as we all
Hmm.
know, trying to replace some materials with others, and developing new technologies for that. Um, and but what is the more interesting substitution that we need to think about? And a lot of this is going to depend on other industries, of course, um, are whether or not new composite materials can come in and replace
Hmm.
some of the metals. So we've already seen that, for example, for lightweighting, right?
All right.
You're,
Yeah.
in automotive, you've seen,
Mm-hmm.
composites and carbon fiber come in. We're seeing that a little bit in aerospace as well. So, for example, some of the drones will have certainly much more composites than others, depending on their use.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but ultimately, a lot of this depends, if we think about the longer term, a lot of this depends on the oil industry and petrochemicals industry as well,
Oh,
in
yeah.
terms of material substitution. So critical materials is a big group, but it also does not exist in a vacuum. And so there's a lot of different aspects that we need to think about.
So you don't think that we will end up in a situation where we need to balance what we want to have, whether we want to have clean energy or whether we want to have drones to defend ourselves?
I see what you're saying. That's a very, very good question. And it is quite possible that, yes, if the correct investments are not made, let's say in the next 5 years, because it takes years, right, to build plants, to build mines, to get new supply. So I think if we don't see enough investment over the next 5 years, that's a real risk that we're going to have to start making very difficult decisions on what we actually want to build out between energy transition and
Mm-hmm.
defense. And unfortunately, the industry that is least willing to pay is going to be the one that suffers. So, that's either a choice for businesses or industry or government to make, or possibly all of them working together to figure out, what is strategically potentially more important than others. But we do need to see more supply come on. Substitution and recycling is not
Mm-hmm.
going to be enough in the next 10 years.
I really don't want to be in the shoes of the person who has to prioritize between the two. Really, but it's. I don't want to end our conversation with a bleak picture like that. Um, where do you see the possibilities, the chances, the opportunities in this kind of field, this new focus on critical raw materials for especially Europe and European upstream producers, European miners?
Yeah, so I think even though I said substitution and recycling will not be
Mm-hmm.
enough over the next 10 years, I think we should see more progress there. Um, and as I said, it's not necessarily, seeing a lot of critical material demand come off. It's
Mm-hmm.
just there will be a little bit of an adjustment that's going to be required in the volumes. And, I always have a very, very optimistic outlook for humanity and its ability to innovate, right? So I think we
Mm.
will see quite a bit of that over the next 10 years. And again, it's going to depend on other industries like oil and petrochem
Mm.
to see exactly how this all evolves. Yeah, for Europe, I think we probably will see a little bit of a reset in terms of targets.
Okay.
One of the ones that I've been looking at, well, been following for the last 2 years, as I'm sure you have as well, is the Critical Raw
Of
Materials
course.
Act,
Of course.
and the goal to reduce dependence,
Mm-hmm.
right, on these countries. That's going to be very difficult to achieve because we're 2 years into this, what was a 7-year plan, right, by
Mm-hmm.
2030. And I'm not sure how much progress has been made for Europe to build its own supply chains yet. So this really needs to happen quite
Mm-hmm.
quickly. And if it does, then that's a great positive. Otherwise, I think that target